a 19-year-old walked onto Johnny Carson's stage and was famous by morning, and gone before he turned 23. A zoo employee came in to manage an elephant and never really left. And one woman performed a comedy routine about grief in front of 30 million people, and none of them knew it was real. There are 10 people whose entire lives changed because Johnny Carson looked at them across a late-night desk and decided they were something the rest of America needed to see. Some of them built empires from that moment. One of them didn't survive it. And one said no to the greatest offer in television history because of everything Carson had quietly taught her. She was 31 years old, and by almost every measure that Hollywood recognized, she was finished. Joan Rivers had spent nearly a decade doing exactly what she was supposed to do. She had worked the comedy club circuit from New York to Los Angeles, refined her material night after night in small rooms that smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled ambition, and knocked on every industry door she could find. Most of those doors stayed closed. By 1965, certain corners of the entertainment world had already written a quiet verdict on Joan Rivers. Too loud, too abrasive, too much. The kind of comedian who might always find a room willing to laugh, but would never quite find the room that mattered. Then, on February 17, 1965, she walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. What followed changed not just Joan Rivers' career, but the architecture of what a woman was permitted to be on American television. When the laughter finally settled, Carson leaned forward at his desk, looked directly at her, and said the words that would define the next 2 decades of her professional life. "God, you're funny," he told her in front of 30 million watching Americans. "You're going to be a star." In the world of late-night television in 1965, that sentence was not a compliment. It was a proclamation. Every network executive, every booking agent, every club owner recalibrated their understanding of Joan Rivers in the space of a single breath. She had arrived on that stage as an unknown. She left it as a certainty. Rivers would return to Carson's couch more than 100 times over the following 18 years, sharp, fearless, and entirely at home, in a format that had initially seemed designed to exclude her. In 1983, Carson named her his permanent guest host. For a woman in American comedy, there was no higher institutional validation available. His loyalty, once extended, was total. His expectation of loyalty in return was equally complete and equally unspoken. Rivers would only learn the full dimensions of that expectation when she violated it. In 1986, the Fox network approached Rivers with an extraordinary offer, $15 million to host her own late-night program. Rather than informing Carson directly, rather than giving him the private conversation he would have considered his due, the news reached him the way news reached the rest of America, through a press release. Rivers maintained she attempted repeatedly to reach Carson by telephone and was met with silence. Carson stated plainly that no such call ever came. What is not disputed is the outcome. Carson placed Joan Rivers on a list from which she would never be removed. A ban so complete that his successor, Jay Leno, honored it for decades out of simple professional respect. The woman who owed the entire architecture of her career to 6 words spoken at Carson's desk was never permitted to return to it. His gift was extraordinary. His loyalty code, when broken, was final. 8 years later, a 19-year-old walked onto that same stage. The price of Carson's gift would never be more clearly illustrated than in what happened to him. On December 6, 1973, a young man named Freddie Prinze walked to the mark on The Tonight Show's studio floor and waited for his moment to begin. He was 19 years old, with no television credits, no industry relationships, and no particular reason to believe the next several minutes would alter the entire direction of his life. What he had was 5 minutes of material built around an identity he had coined for himself. Hungarican, the son of a Hungarian father and a Puerto Rican mother, a young man from Washington Heights who had learned to transform the texture of his own background into something that made strangers laugh. The set was extraordinary. The studio audience responded with the kind of immediate, instinctive enthusiasm that cannot be manufactured and cannot be coached. And then, at its conclusion, Carson did something that had never happened in the program's entire history. He invited the debuting comedian to sit beside him on the couch. This gesture, the couch invite, as it was known among industry insiders, there was the highest validation Carson's platform could offer. No comedian had ever received it on a first appearance. When Prince settled into the seat beside him, Carson said, "You're gonna do fine." 30 million Americans heard it simultaneously. Within 10 months, Freddie Prinze was starring in the NBC sitcom Chico and the Man alongside Jack Albertson. The program became an immediate success, and Prince became, almost overnight, one of the most recognizable young faces in American entertainment. By 1976, less than 3 years after that evening, he was headlining in Las Vegas and serving as a guest host for Carson himself. The trajectory was so steep, so unrelenting, that it seemed to defy the ordinary laws of how careers were built, and of how a young person could be expected to absorb such transformation. The pressure accompanying Prince's accelerated rise intensified the personal struggles he had carried long before Carson's endorsement. Those who knew him later described a young man whose private life was in profound conflict with the triumphant public image the industry required of him. He had developed a reliance on prescription medications, and those closest to him watched with growing concern as the distance between who he was privately and who the world now expected him to be became increasingly difficult to navigate. Freddie Prinze was lost to his family and to the world in January of 1977. He was 22 years old. The circumstances surrounding his passing, contested for years afterward in courtrooms by those who loved him, left behind a sorrow that touched everyone who had watched his extraordinary rise. Carson, by multiple accounts, was profoundly affected. The young man he had endorsed with the rarest gesture in his professional vocabulary had not survived the gift. He was 19 years old when the full weight of Carson's endorsement landed on him, and 22 when it became more than he could carry. Carson's world could accelerate everything except wisdom. It could amplify talent, but not time. These are the stories his program rarely had the chance to tell, and they are part of why, all these years later, we feel compelled to tell them now. If you have found yourself moved by these stories, by the extraordinary range of what Carson's platform could give and what it could demand, we would be honored to have you subscribe to this channel. We explore the golden age of Hollywood every week with the care and the respect these stories deserve. The subscribe button is just below. And we have 8 more remarkable stories still ahead tonight. After his retirement, Johnny Carson made one final gesture toward the man he had always believed should inherit his desk, and he made it in a way that no television audience ever saw. David Letterman first arrived at The Tonight Show in November of 1978, and what Carson heard in him was a reflection of something fundamental in himself. The dry, ironic, Midwestern intelligence Letterman brought to the stage, the humor that found absurdity in the ordinary, the comedy that lived in the gap between what people said and what they meant, was the same aesthetic that had guided Carson's instincts for nearly 2 decades. When Carson watched Letterman work, he watched with the particular attention of a man seeing his own values expressed by someone younger and still forming. This was not casual appreciation, this was mentorship. Between 1980 and 1981, Carson selected Letterman to guest host The Tonight Show 51 times. 51. This was not a booking decision, it was a declaration. Broadcast across 2 years of national television, visible to every person in the industry who understood how to read such signals. Carson put his name on the program, his own company produced it, his own reputation guaranteed it. That is not an endorsement, that is a declaration. Late Night with David Letterman debuted on NBC in 1982 as a direct result. When Carson announced his retirement, those who understood his relationship with Letterman assumed the succession was already decided. The chair would pass to the man Carson had spent a decade preparing to receive it. NBC chose Jay Leno. The decision stunned the entertainment community and wounded Letterman in ways he discussed openly for years afterward. Carson said almost nothing in public. 30 years of professional discretion left very little room for grievance, and he did not abandon it at the end. But he did not accept the institution's verdict in silence. After his retirement, Carson began sending Letterman original jokes for his late-night monologue. A private gesture conducted quietly between 2 men who had built something together and watched an institution fail to honor what they had built. Rivers had broken his code, and he had closed the door completely. Letterman had kept faith, And Carson kept faith with him, long after anyone was watching and long after it was required of him. The contrast between these two stories tells you more about who Johnny Carson truly was than any interview he ever gave. A man who honored loyalty across decades, across retirement, in gestures no television audience ever witnessed. And having seen Carson in his fullness, his generosity, his code, his capacity for both extraordinary nurturing and absolute consequence, we are ready to see a side of his instincts that operated on an entirely different principle. Not every career he created began with a comedian looking for their first break. Some of it was considerably less rehearsed and considerably less housebroken. There is a particular pleasure in stories where no one is trying to become famous. Joan Embury was a zoology student and employee at the San Diego Zoo in the early 1970s. When she received an invitation, she understood purely in professional terms. A segment had been arranged for The Tonight Show. There would be an elephant, named Carol, trained to paint. Carson's producers needed someone from the zoo to accompany it, manage it, and ensure that whatever happened next happened safely in a studio not remotely designed for large mammals. Embury arrived not as a performer seeking recognition, but as a professional doing her job. What Carson recognized in that first appearance was something that could not have been engineered or rehearsed. Embury was completely herself, knowledgeable, composed, entirely untroubled by the chaos that results when a painting elephant enters a television studio in front of 30 million viewers. While other guests adjusted their personalities for the camera, Embury simply did what she would have done at the zoo. He brought her back, then back again. There was one evening that those who worked the segment never quite forgot. A large primate Embury had brought became agitated under the studio lights, broke from her hold, and crossed the set entirely, heading directly toward Carson's desk. The crew froze. Carson leaned back slowly, keeping his eyes on the animal with the careful stillness of a man who has decided that the least movement is the wisest one. Embury crossed the set in measured, unhurried steps, speaking in a low and steady voice, and guided the animal back to her side with a composure so complete that the studio audience broke into applause. Not for the comedy of what had happened, but for the quiet authority with which she had resolved it. Carson looked at her afterward with an expression in those present described as closer to admiration than amusement. He knew exactly what he had just watched. Nearly 70 appearances with Carson established Joan Embury as a recurring fixture in American living rooms. When Carson retired and Jay Leno inherited the program, she appeared 30 additional times, a continuity that spoke to how thoroughly she had become part of the program's identity, rather than merely one of its guests. A syndicated educational television series brought her expertise to audiences far beyond Carson's studio. A global wildlife conservation foundation took shape, built on the credibility that decades of national television had provided. The woman who had arrived at NBC as an elephants handler became one of the most recognizable advocates for wildlife conservation in the country. She had not planned any of it. She had simply been herself in a room where the right person was watching. Joan Embury's story is the gentlest chapter in tonight's account, a reminder that Carson's instincts were not always about recognizing ambition or genius, but sometimes about recognizing something quieter. Simple, authentic excellence in a person who hadn't thought to want anything from him at all. But from this warmth, we turn to a story that required years of patience so deliberate it bordered on faith, and a wager so quiet that almost no one understood what was being staked until it had already paid off completely. In May of 1981, Carson watched Jerry Seinfeld perform a set that most industry professionals would have considered promising but unremarkable. What no one understood, what would only become clear 8 years later, was that Carson had just decided to make one of the most patient bets of his entire career. Seinfeld's material was focused on the small, precise textures of ordinary daily life, the specific frustrations of minor social situations, the absurdity of things everyone experienced but no one had quite articulated this way. His comedy was clean, carefully constructed, governed by an economy of language that treated every unnecessary word as a failure of craft. He was not the most energetic performer Carson had seen that year. He was, however, one of the most precise. Carson had spent 30 years building comedy out of timing and restraint and the exact placement of a pause. He knew the difference between a comedian who was funny and a comedian who was building something. What he saw in Seinfeld that May evening was a comedian who was building something. He brought him back. While the rest of the industry was rewarding volume and energy, steering young comedians toward bigger gestures and performances that announced themselves the moment they entered a room, Carson was quietly moving in the opposite direction. Industry veterans openly questioned whether Seinfeld's restrained, conversational style had the energy a national audience required. Carson disagreed, and for most of the decade, he was the only person in a position of real power who did. Seinfeld returned to The Tonight Show, once, then again, then again. By 1989, he was no longer a guest. He was already their comedian. Familiar in voice, familiar in sensibility, with an audience prepared to follow him anywhere. Every booking was a judgment, and for 8 consecutive years, Carson's judgment was the same. This man belongs here, and America needs more time with him. By the time Seinfeld debuted on NBC in the summer of 1989, it required no introduction. The 9 seasons and 180 episodes that followed were built on a foundation Carson had been quietly laying across the entire previous decade. 7 careers into tonight's story, and the question Carson apparently never stopped asking himself remains the animating force of everything we have covered. Who else is out there? Who is performing right now in a room too small for what they actually are? If that question is part of what brings you here on evenings like this one, we would love to have you in this community permanently. The subscribe button is below, and we are grateful for every person in it. And if you have been surprised by any of tonight's stories, we would genuinely love to know which one caught you most off guard and what aspect of classic Hollywood you would like us to explore next. The comments are open, and we read every single one. Now, from Seinfeld's decade of patient refinement, we turn to a performer who needed no decade at all. She needed one evening, one stage, and the particular courage to stand in front of 30 million people and tell the truth about a life they had been pretending didn't exist. Before August of 1985, Roseanne Barr had spent years developing her comedy in the clubs of Denver, Colorado. The industry had told her no, the material was too rough, too specific, too far from the polished urban sophistication that late-night television preferred. She was not the comedian the gatekeepers were looking for. She was exactly the comedian 30 million viewers had been waiting for. Carson understood it immediately. Her persona, the domestic goddess, was built from the daily reality of being a working-class housewife in America. The grocery bills that never quite stretched far enough. The household labor that never ended and was never acknowledged. The particular exhaustion of being responsible for everything and credited for nothing. Loud, unapologetic. Rooted in the experience of women, the entertainment industry had systematically treated as invisible. When Barr took the stage in August of 1985, she performed with the authority of someone who had refined her material across years, in rooms far less forgiving than Carson's studio. Her set was not polished in the conventional sense. It was completely, entirely itself. A voice speaking plainly about a reality the room recognized. Carson's response told the entire industry that this voice had genuine commercial viability, that the gatekeepers had been wrong. Among those 30 million viewers that evening were Marcy Carsey and Tom Werner, the producers who had developed The Cosby Show and were actively looking for their next project. What they saw in Roseanne Barr that night, validated by Carson's visible enthusiasm, was the foundation of something entirely new. What they built from it changed American television permanently. Roseanne depicted a working-class family, the Connors of Lanford, Illinois, with a specificity and honesty that had not previously appeared on network television. It debuted on ABC in October of 1988 and became a defining cultural force immediately. For millions of viewers who had spent decades watching television depict family life as something cleaner and more comfortable than their own, it was the first program that looked like the truth. Roseanne Barr had spent years being told she was too much. Carson spent one evening telling 30 million Americans she was exactly enough. And the America that watched understood, just as Carson had, that they had been waiting a long time to hear someone say it. Not every career on tonight's list carried that kind of cultural weight. Some were quieter in their significance, more methodical in their construction, and ultimately just as lasting. Because sometimes what Carson recognized was not a movement waiting to be born, but simply a man with an extraordinary talent for being reliably, genuinely himself. and the discipline to sustain that across a body of work unlike anything the industry had seen before. David Brenner was not, by any conventional definition, a stand-up comedian when he first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1971. He was an Emmy award-winning documentary filmmaker, an outsider to the form he was about to spend the rest of his career practicing. What he possessed was an observational intelligence that translated with remarkable naturalness into the comedy of everyday life. Carson recognized it within the first minutes and brought him back, then back again. What very few people understood was what it actually cost to keep coming back, to remain genuinely fresh and compelling on the 140th appearance as much as the first required a discipline that bordered on the extraordinary. Carson's standards were absolute. He had no patience for guests who coasted on previous goodwill. Every appearance Brenner made was an audition for the next one, earned repeatedly across decades. There was one evening those who worked the show still recalled with particular clarity. Brenner arrived having spent the previous week unwell, and his material that night was not where it needed to be. He knew it was going in. He walked out anyway, worked the room with everything he had, and found his footing halfway through in a way the audience never registered as a struggle, only as the natural rhythm of a man completely comfortable in conversation. Carson said nothing about it afterward. He simply rebooked him. Those who understood how Carson operated understood what that meant. He had watched closely, and he had seen something he respected. 158 total appearances, 75 guest host slots. Neither figure has been surpassed by any entertainer in the program's history. He had built something that had not previously existed: the professional guest, the entertainer for whom The Tonight Show was not a launching pad to somewhere else, but the destination itself. Carson recognized it. He rewarded it 158 times. But consistency was not the only quality Carson recognized. Sometimes his instincts led him toward something so genuinely unlike anything he had encountered that his response was not a quiet campaign of endorsement. It was immediate. It was almost urgent. And it happened in the space of 6 days. Stephen Wright was discovered performing at a venue in Cambridge, Massachusetts that operated as a Chinese restaurant during the day and transformed into a comedy club after the dinner service ended. He had no agent, no manager, no industry connections, and material that would have been genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't heard it. Wright's style was slow, deliberate. His delivery was a near monotone that revealed, on closer attention, an extraordinarily precise control of pace and silence. His material began in recognizable reality and arrived at surreal conclusions through a logic that was both entirely absurd and internally consistent. In an era of high-energy performance, Wright simply stood at the microphone and let the words do everything. On August 6, 1982, this man performed on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Carson's reaction was something beyond the enthusiastic approval he routinely extended to performers he admired, closer to the particular pleasure of encountering something entirely outside one's previous experience. What was not expected was what Carson did immediately afterward. He rebooked Wright within the same week, not in several months. Stephen Wright returned to The Tonight Show on August 12, 1982, 6 days after his debut. Among an industry that read Carson's booking decisions as professional pronouncements, an immediate rebooking communicated something close to urgency. This is not merely good, this must be seen again. Now, most comedians spend years building the material for a single Tonight Show appearance. Wright had done exactly that. 3 years of carefully constructed work burned through in a single evening. He had 6 days to prepare for the second. What Carson's endorsement accomplished was the legitimization of an entire aesthetic approach the mainstream industry had not previously recognized as viable. The deliberate pace, the surreal logic, the unforgettable deadpan delivery, all of it was now something American audiences had been shown they could embrace completely. The career that followed has lasted more than 4 decades. Wright's voice, unmistakable, unhurried, entirely unlike anyone else who has ever stood at a microphone, remains as distinctive today as it was in that Cambridge restaurant before Carson found it. If tonight's stories have stirred your love of this remarkable era, of Carson's desk, of the careers that grew from the courage it took to stand in front of it, we would be so grateful if you would like this video and share it with someone in your life who loves classic Hollywood. These stories deserve to be passed along. And our two final chapters tonight are, in many ways, the most remarkable of all. There was an offer made to Gary Shandling that most people in the entertainment industry would have considered impossible to decline, the most coveted seat in American television. The late-night throne that Carson was vacating. Shandling looked at it carefully, thought about what he would have to become in order to sit in it, and said no. To understand why, you need to understand how he came to be in a position to be asked. In the spring of 1977, Shandling emerged from a serious automobile accident requiring a significant recovery. He had been a successful sitcom writer, credits that included Sanford and Son, and the accident changed his perspective in the way that an unexpected confrontation with one's own vulnerability sometimes does. He emerged with a different intention, to stand on a stage and be personally responsible for whether an audience responded. He began performing stand-up comedy. By 1981, he was ready for The Tonight Show. His debut was, by any measure, a significant success. Intelligence, timing, a conversational ease that made the studio audience feel they were overhearing something natural rather than watching something performed. When Joan Rivers departed in 1986, Shandling became Carson's permanent guest host, standing at the very center of late-night television's most powerful machinery. What Shandling did with that proximity was unusual. Rather than using his position as a platform for personal advancement, he used it as an education. He observed with the attention of a writer how the machinery of Carson's program actually functioned. The way conversations were shaped, spontaneity was structured, the host's persona simultaneously genuine and constructed. He learned from the inside where the performance was and where the reality lived. This knowledge became the foundation for two of the most formally inventive television programs of the following decades. Gary Shandling's show debuted in 1986, openly acknowledging that its characters lived inside a television sitcom. The Larry Sanders Show arrived on HBO in 1992 as a precise examination of exactly the world Shandling had spent years inhabiting. Its vanities, its hierarchies, its careful construction of apparent naturalness. Both programs required the granular insider knowledge that only years inside Carson's program could have provided. Then came the offer. Tonight, show producer Peter Lasalle believed Shandling was the right person to permanently succeed Carson. NBC extended a formal offer. The late-night chair was available to him. Shandling said no. He had been offered the keys to the most powerful room in television and chosen, with apparent clarity, to remain in the hallway with his notebook. The most convincing explanation is also the simplest. Shandling understood that the most valuable thing his years inside Carson's world had given him was perspective. And perspective, once surrendered to the position it observes, is very difficult to recover. He kept his perspective, he made his art from it, and the two programs that resulted stand as the most unusual legacy on tonight's entire list. Created by the man who was offered Carson's chair and chose instead to spend his career explaining what that chair truly was. Which brings us at last to the evening that stands apart from everything else in this story. The night when a young woman walked to the microphone with grief in her material and history in her hands, and neither she nor the 30 million people watching had any idea what they were about to witness. On November 28, 1986, Ellen DeGeneres was a regional comedy club performer, well regarded by those who had seen her work, and entirely unknown to the 30 million people who tuned in to The Tonight Show that evening. She had prepared a routine called Phone Call to God, a one-sided telephone conversation between a woman and the divine, navigating the absurdities of filing an insurance claim for a cat that had recently moved on, working through hold times and bureaucratic indifference with the Almighty himself. The comedy was in the small-scale human frustration placed against a cosmic backdrop, the humor that results from applying ordinary procedural logic to transcendent circumstances. What almost no one in the television audience could have known was that the routine had not been written as a comedy exercise. It had been written as a way to process grief. Sometime before that November evening, DeGeneres had lost a close friend and former companion in a heartbreaking accident. She had written the Phone Call to God routine as a means of making some kind of sense from a loss that resisted ordinary understanding. The comedy was entirely real. The sorrow beneath it was equally real. She was performing both simultaneously in front of 30 million strangers, and only she knew it. The set was exceptional. Precision, timing, emotional intelligence expressed through perfect placement rather than volume. The studio audience responded with the warmth of genuine recognition. Here was something true. Here was someone genuinely herself. Carson made the invitation to the couch. In the 24-year history of The Tonight Show, across thousands of debut performances, no female comedian had ever been invited to sit beside Carson during her first appearance. It had created Freddie Prinze's career 13 years earlier. It had never, not once in 24 years, been extended to a woman making her debut. Ellen DeGeneres crossed that floor and sat down beside Johnny Carson. And in doing so, she closed a chapter in television history that was far too long. The industry read the signal completely, immediately, and with lasting professional consequences. DeGeneres was no longer a regional performer. She was a national figure. The momentum Carson's endorsement created carried her toward the sitcom Ellen, which debuted in 1994 and made its own landmark moment in television history, and toward a daytime program that ran for 19 seasons. All of it traceable in a direct and unbroken line to one November evening and one invitation across a studio floor. She had not planned to make history. What she received was the same thing Carson had given Joan Rivers in 1965, the same thing he had given Freddie Prinze in 1973, the same thing he had given, in his particular and deliberate way, to each of the remarkable people in tonight's account. He saw her, and then he said so in front of everyone. 10 careers, 30 years, 30 million witnesses every night. Carson's gift was not fame. Fame was only the mechanism, the practical consequence of his endorsement moving through an industry that trusted his judgment with extraordinary completeness. His gift was something more fundamental and far more rare. It was recognition. He saw what was true and valuable in each of these people before the industry did, before their audiences did, in some cases before the performers understood it themselves. And what he could not always do, what his story asks us to hold with honesty and tenderness, was protect what he had seen from every force that fame unleashed. But the careers he built, the programs they produced, the laughter and the cultural shifts and the landmark moments that happened because one man trusted his own eyes, those are not gone. A close associate once remarked that Carson understood something about his role that most people in his position never quite grasped. He did not think of himself primarily as someone who made stars. He thought of himself as someone who was fortunate enough to be in the room when remarkable things happened, and sensible enough to make sure that others were looking in the right direction. That, more than anything else, may be the most honest account of what he was. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and for your love of this golden era that shaped so much of what we carry with us still. If tonight's stories have meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel. We are here every week exploring the world of classic Hollywood with the warmth and the care it deserves. Share this with someone you love who treasures this era, and know that the stories waiting in the weeks ahead are every bit as extraordinary as the ones we told tonight. It simply became the thing we remember when we want to remember something worth keeping.